This is Computing Up, conversations about computation writ large with Michael Littman and Dave Ackley. This episode was recorded February 19th, 2024.
So this is our recording for February, which I always thought was the cruelest month. There's an expression, the cruelest month, which I always assume was February because it's like short and mean and cold. But I looked it up and it's not actually. Do you know what the cruelest month is?
March?
Apparently it's April. April is the cruelest month according to, I guess, T.S. Eliot. And it's cruel because it's so pleasant and it's starting again. And it means the whole cycle is going to start over again. And
that's terrible. Oh my
right?
God. It's like spring is horrible. The cruelest season.
I don't know poetry. It's maybe ironic or something.
T.S. Eliot might not be the source on this. Maybe you should
maybe it's a different
somebody
Eliot.
else. Yeah.
From the wasteland. But anyway, I'm super excited because so I know that you're really interested in wrapping your head around what computation and sort of those kinds of ideas could tell us about how we can govern better and how we can kind of work together as individuals, but also as a group organism. Like, I think you think about these things sort of a lot at many different scales, and it's come up in a couple of our calls. Yeah. So just around the time that we were having a discussion about that, I saw an announcement for a talk at Brown, and the title was A Mathematical Model for Representative Democracy. And I thought, that sounds like it would be really cool. And then I realized, wait, that's happening at Brown. I'm in Virginia. I'm going to miss this. So I just kind of on a lark, sent an email to the speaker, said, hey, I missed your talk. Would you mind talking to me and Dave about it? And Manon said that she would do so. So we have as our guest today, Manon Revel. So Manon, thank you for being here.
Thank you very much.
Awesome.
It's an honor to be with you.
And am I saying your name right?
Almost. It's Manon in French, but
Manon.
We have this. Yes, perfect.
Oh, that's better. That is much better. And revel is such a great word. I always like the word revel because it's like lever backwards, and it just there's got interesting patterns and stuff going on. But then I never saw it as a name, so that's so cool. Your name is so cool.
Thank you.
So can you tell us about how we can be thinking about democracy from a mathematical perspective? Is this something that's going to help democracy be a better thing, or is it going to help math be a better thing, or neither?
It's a really vast, problem and program. I started working on this question as a just worried citizen. I've been working in math for most of my life, and I realized that I was getting to a point where this idea that democracy was this end of history and this end game was just starting to be not as clear as it anymore. I started feeling that maybe democracy was just a comma in history. And I also grew up always being fascinated both by math and politics. And when I started my PhD, I thought that there was a good time to start thinking whether I could study democracy with a mathematical lens. And what I kind of heard in your question at the beginning, Michael, is that we rarely think of democracy and math as coming close to one another. And a critique I often hear from people that have been studying democracy from the social sciences is that they feel we're just trying to impose math models to make, cooler mathematics and create just, and we prove more theorems, but that these theorems don't actually have bearings for democratic studies. And I think both of these things can be true at the same time. It is true that the models are not a one-to-one map onto reality. I think that sometimes I think of the field as trying to do what physicists did for nature. I like to think that we are trying to better understand almost the laws of nature or the laws of physics that are governing human behavior. But then I always remind myself that we are trying to theorize agents that feel and that theorize themselves. And there seems to be this exponential complexity, this nested complexity within the system that makes it's not as straightforward probably to think that we can model, humans with mathematical models and think that we have any predictive power by imposing mathematical models into democracy.
Right. And I feel like there's a really long history of people like almost hubris, like believing, wait, I'm really good at math. People are just things in the world like physics, like physicists can understand anything. And then just doing a terrible job, really, because people are so complicated and so, like you say, self-reflective and therefore, as Dave liked to say, we're programmable, right? So we can actually kind of rewrite our behavior on the fly. Some very low level things, maybe not. I've never learned how to not blink when something's coming at my face, but mostly we're just very flexible in terms of our behavior. And so that feels like a terrible idea. So maybe you could maybe you could take a step back and tell us how you got to where you are. Like where are you now? What in your background sort of academically led you to be able to put these two pieces together? Like, are you a mathematician? Are you a social scientist? Are you both? Yeah. So tell us about yourself.
Yeah, sure. And I'll start by saying, so I'm a researcher at Harvard, and I just graduated from a PhD at MIT in this program called the Social and Engineering Systems and Statistics.
Whoa!
And
Help us parse that. Social.
I know.
Social
and engineering
systems
and statistics.
Yes. because statistics didn't have anywhere else to go, so it just kind of jumped on at the end. So social and engineering, yeah. So okay, so that sounds very, very explicitly like the kinds of things that you're thinking about. Social engineering, not social engineering, which is a different thing, but social and engineering systems. Yeah.
And this is actually a very new program, and I think there is even an interesting story in the kind of academics, side of things, where the program was created in 2015 with the intention of having researchers focusing on social problems, social systems, bringing in some methods from mathematical fields and statistical fields. And the way I've been thinking about the program is actually a metaphor that the founder of the program, Monzerdele, told me once. He said that if we look at social problems, we can't be bound to the methods of one particular field, because most social problems are actually too complex to just be owned by, math or philosophy or any such field. So he gave me this metaphor that I like. He said that I could think of the fields as these black holes that have these gravitational singularities that concentrate a lot of depth and knowledge and mass. And he said that in the program, his intention is that we live at the event horizons of multiple fields, so that we really get, we infuse the knowledge that there is in the different, that they are in the different fields, and we try to never actually be swallowed by the gravitational singularity.
I certainly like the idea of looking at interdisciplinary work as stay out of the black hole, because that seems like a good idea.
It's always trying to pull you in.
Well, and it's certainly true that disciplines form around paradigms, key assumptions, and they take those things as pretty much God-given, and the assumptions and paradigms of one field can be quite incompatible with the assumptions and paradigms of another field, and that's why you get this disciplinary separation, and it's why it's a perpetual fight, I think, to do interdisciplinary work and manage to find traction either or both or however many disciplines one's combining.
Yes, and I'm sure as you've also been in academia, how much you feel the drift and the current is really pulling you to just collapse onto a particular dimension. And I think really what's at the core of the philosophy of the founders of the program is that we are getting at a point where the systems we're studying are so complex that we can't just borrow methods from one field, and it is very hard. And it, as you say, the assumptions are conflicting all the time, and it does feel hard to reconcile two ideas that seem so contradictory but yet have to be true at the same time. And so that being said, I came from a mathematical background. I did all of my studies in France in a very the traditional kind of path that we have, where we have this theoretical training for 2 years where I was doing mathematics and physics, and then focus on applied math before coming at MIT. And so this has been kind of where I came from. Applied math is a very big environment. And so I've been particularly focused on this field that is called computational social choice theory, that is known to be the field of Nicolas de Condorcet and Kenneth Arrow. And you have a lot of different aspects that have been covered by social choice theory. And so this has been kind of my mathematical home. But I've been living at this event horizon. And the social system I study is democracy. And so after spending a few years working on math models for democracy, it came pretty clear to me that, as you were saying, Michael, at the beginning, something didn't seem quite modelizable with democracy. And I felt that I had to get much closer to reality in some sense. So I chose to go towards political philosophy to be closer to reality, which might be an arguable choice.
Philosophy and reality, how close they are, have to figure it out.
I felt it was closer to reality than math, but definitely I just started my journey towards,
Towards
more
reality.
towards reality. And in particular, I worked in the field of theory of representation, of democratic representation. And I think the reason why I felt it was much more practical in a sense is that my understanding of political philosophy, it's that it's been a field that over the centuries always expires and get renewed. And in a way it expires because the human nature doesn't really change, but the initial conditions in which you initiate your new system, change. Like Hobbes' assumptions are really different from Madison's assumption, and then you get into different systems of representation that are being built and thought and normatively justified. So this is kind of, yeah,
Right,
I'd
right.
say
Yeah, yeah.
math and philosophy has been my recent focus.
Oh, that's great. Certainly, when you say, you were approaching it just sort of as an ordinary person and feeling like, democracy needs our help or something like that, that's exactly where I'm coming from as well, but from a sort of computational and software engineering and computer architecture point of view rather than a more pure math point of view, but with the same goal, to say, is there ways that we can understand what is going on around us in a way that will enhance the ability and what the hell is democracy anyway, and how should we think about it, all of that stuff. So I was looking at your Google Scholar page and just clicking around to try to see who we were going to talk to today, and so I see this liquid democracy. Can you set that up for us, because I have a lot of questions.
Sure. And I will do this by maybe first saying a word about, exactly what are the assumptions that I have when I think about democracy, because um,
Great.
we can debate them, but I think they're important to kind of build the whole argument. So I think that when we think about democracy, there is this core assumption that we make, which is about the importance of having human self-determinant. And so this idea of human freedom, that's is really kind of the, value cornerstone on which we build systems of governance. And maybe we can debate this, but if you agree
Well,
that you take for
that sounds
granted,
good as far as it goes. I mean,
right?
freedom A, freedom B, whatever. Off we go. Sure.
It does sound like a mild assumption, but I'm just making all of my assumptions
No,
clear.
no,
This is
I
my
love it. Go, go,
mathematical
go.
training. So that's assumption one. And if you agree with this assumption, then and you also agree with the fact that we need at least weak forms of governments, just because we need to have, a minimum level of cooperation and coordination in societies is something that sounds pretty natural, in fact. And so we need this third party layer that is helping us, because we are a species that doesn't have this endogenous governance systems, apparently. So we have governments, and there is this core tension when you think about having a government. The government protects your freedom, but also sometimes impairs your freedom because it's going to
Absolutely.
coerce you to do things that you're not always agreeing with.
Sure.
And so this creates a very core tension that sometimes we don't really like to think in terms of tension. So we just try to think that either we should not have a government, or either we should have a government that's really protecting all of our freedoms. But the reality is that we live with this tension, and
Yes,
as humans and
absolutely.
as philosophers, and so the way we have to get out of this tension right now is to think that for me to be able to accept to be coerced by a decision I may sometimes disagree with, I need to give consent to this third party system that is deciding on my behalf. And the place we're getting at with, I think, one of the nicest justification has been given by John Stuart Mill, is the idea that the best way to give consent is through active participation. And if you start thinking about consent of the governed being given through active participation, you get a democratic system. And but something that is also clear when you think about a system of governance and a democratic governance is that it is really hard to do democracy in the direct sense when you have a large nation, because it's just really hard. It does seem
Right.
impossible to take decisions with the 300,000 million people. So we came up with this idea of representative government. And you have kind of two ways of thinking about why and how we do representative governments. The first route is saying that it's just a practical reality. We can't have large congresses, so we need to just pick a few people. And in that sense, representation is a lesser form of democracy, because it's not allowing us to live democracy at its fullest with in the direct
Everybody
sense of
vote on
everyone.
everything. Yeah.
Exactly. And so with this idea that representation is a lesser form of democracy, then you just have this practical thing that you need to pick some people. And if you're consistent in that route, for me, the only institution, well, I guess where I'm at with my thinking, the only institution that makes sense if you're in that line of thought is representation by lot. it's taking citizens as random because no citizen should, have a chance of being a representative more than others. And that's
Because we
been
have an assumption of base equality that we're adding to our set of things that we want to have. And that's why picking randomly is motivated
yeah.
like that. And people could disagree with thinking that everybody should be equal or everybody should be treated equal, or they might or might not admit it, but they could think that. So for sure, absolutely. I mean, one little asterisk, I would say the idea that the goal would be everybody votes for everything, and we just for practical reasons can't do that. I think, I mean, to me, that misses a little bit because that's a sort of classic example of thinking centralization from, no structure in the middle, that you should have individuals and then you should have a nationwide, entire universe vote. Whereas what we need to be thinking about, my hobby horse, is this idea of structure at all scales. And so the representative layer that you're suggesting in the American system, for example, or parliamentary system, is one example of an intermediate layer of structure, but just having one isn't necessarily right either. And it seems like, if we could come up with some generalization, some brilliant thing that would recapitulate at different sizes, then that would be the sort of thing that we would want. And I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to get it so that it has the right spirit, so it doesn't get corrupted by middle management that has, their own purposes in mind. Yeah, something like that. So I just wanted to put that in to set up the direction you're going with this structure.
But actually, before I go on with my structure, I had a question back to this. So, what would you think of having a system where you have multiple layers? And in fact, it's something that you do already have in the way American institutions are set up. And
Sure.
you were to choose everyone randomly at every layer. Would you be satisfied with something like this?
The key is, in order to pick randomly, you have to define a universe of randomness that you're picking from. And since I am very concerned with spatialized computations, where you can't just assume that at every level you're picking from the entire universe of population, you're going to have to come up with some substructure that defines the universe of that you're being random over. Everybody in the house, we're going to pick randomly to vote. Everybody in the town, we're going to pick randomly to vote. And as long as we link together the spatial scales and the governance scales, I don't know. I mean, that seems really good. What do you think?
Yeah, I think if you're in this mindset that representation is just a limitation of democracy, and what is core to the democratic legitimacy is having a perfect representation of the demos, then I agree. I think, and it's also another thing that we care a lot about in computational social choice, which I think sortition is amongst the only system that actually has it, is it's really hard to game. It's really hard to game a system. I say sortition, so
What is sortition?
yes, so it's actually the name of the system in which you draw citizens that are representatives at random. And you have different terms. You have lotocracy, sortition, democracy by lot. They all mean the same thing. It's having a system of representation through random lots.
Where it pushes the decision about what the random universe is off to be settled later?
It sounds like
Like towns versus states and so forth. The universe for random drawing is decided separately from the idea of being a sortition system.
Yes, often it is sort of using the current boundaries that we have. So, we have a city council. Maybe the city councilors could be
Oh,
drawn at random, and then you have a state legislator, and the state legislators can be drawn at random. So,
From the state, from the city. Yes. Okay.
exactly, yeah.
All right.
So that's route one is thinking of representation as a lesser form of democracy. And you had another argument that has been about thinking of representation as a greater form of democracy, in
okay.
which you assume that you have different versions of the argument. Maybe the common threads amongst all of them is that being a politician as being a cook and a pastry chef and a shoemaker is a job, and that people have different interests in different jobs, and people have different skills for different jobs. And there is this idea that maybe you have a way of finding the representatives that would have some particular self-motivation, as long as it's not trying to satisfy self-interest, but trying to be self-motivated for the common good. And there is kind of this idea almost, and there's a French philosopher, Labessière, who really explains this like this. He said it's division of labor. It's you're going to have some people that will be, more motivated and maybe better at governing than other people. The crux is that it's really hard to actually defining a priori what it means to be, politically skilled or virtuous or anything. And so you use the principle of having systems like elections, or just you're using participation to say who is actually going to be the person representing the others. And this is the second line of thought, where you have this idea that representation can actually be a greater form of democracy, where participation is used to identify the
I see.
representative.
Right. So there will be some people who are better natural politicians, but again, asterisk, assuming good faith, they would do a better job as politicians and so forth. But except for that asterisk, I'm good with this. I see the line.
Yeah, I mean, I think
Go
it's.
ahead.
I'm thinking about this in the context of like an academic department, right? Which is something that we've all had experience, like at least the three of us have all had experience with, and probably some of our listeners too, where there's always this sort of interesting dynamic where you kind of don't want the people who are really good at it because they
don't want to do it.
No, the people who are like really skilled at manipulating people, you don't want them. You want the people who would actually be good representatives and can actually connect with people and are a little bit selfless. And yeah, those people don't want to do it. It's an incredible inconvenience.
Right. So it's sort of suggesting that the people who are good at manipulating people will probably already be corrupt, because they've been manipulating people all their life, and so they violate the asterisk, and that's why we don't want them.
Right. And so you sometimes hear like we want the person who doesn't want the job. Like if you actually stand up and say, "Hey, I'd like to be department chair," people are like,
then you say you're vetoed.
Wait a second.
Yeah. Well, so then that's the random pick example. I guess.
And departments do, I wouldn't say random picking, but there is definitely, sometimes people call it a rotating chair, where the idea is that we're trying to spread this around, that everybody has to, do that role for some amount of time. Not so much for representativeness, but just because to spread the load, because it's like an extra job.
Well, it also reduces the leverage of any one person in the chair position. And I'm all for reducing leverage as sort of a basic safety principle.
All right. So I just wanted, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. I just kind of like, this is what I'm hearing as you're describing this. All right.
I think that's super in line with everything we're in general thinking about. This asterisk is super important indeed, because you might make a normative argument that you'd like to have people that are self-motivated, but if this correlates too much with trying to satisfy your self-interest, then you get into big troubles. And then again, having something like some type of randomness reduces a lot the incentive to manipulate, because you may invest a lot of time or effort and actually not be rewarded because you have some randomness in the process. But so these have been kind of two, and there are maybe also high-level models to be thinking about how we do democracies, but in reality, we probably want a little bit of both worlds. We want to have a system that enforces equality as much as possible. Equality is just a direct corollary of freedom of humans. So I think this is a core idea, of course, in the democratic ideal. And you also have maybe this idea that competitive elections or competitive selections might also bring about some interesting process that brings about some notion of either expertise or knowledge or vision that is also something that is favorable to a democratic form of government. And if we had to decide in which type of democracies we're living nowadays, it's pretty clear that we live heavily on the second type of democracies, where the way in which we designed elections has been with this idea of having competitive struggle towards gaining, votes of citizens, and as we know, election is a institution amongst so many other possibilities, and it seems to be the case that institutions of any kind, a bit like iron, get oxidated over time. And in the case of an institution, it's not that iron get oxidated and institution gets. I like this terms of Bruce Schneier, they get hacked. And what it means and it's not supposed to be a word that has any negative meaning. It's just the fact that, the world changes, and we learn how to understand and play around with the institutions that we build. And then sometimes they're not actually creating the goals or the outcomes for which they were designed.
For sure.
Yeah, the
And this is kind of
gaming the system in some sense, right?
Well, we
yeah.
make up an algorithm or a process or a mechanism, and we have some intention in mind. But once the mechanism is implemented, it's its own thing, and you can do all kinds of stuff that was more or less orthogonal or anti our original intentions. But now it will work because this algorithm has been reified in a machine, and you can manipulate the machine in that way. So, hacking it is kind of just like, you know, making the machine do something other than the intentions of the machine maker, and that's inevitable. I think at
Yeah.
some level, the question goes then is how can we minimize it? How can we try to keep things heading in the right direction? Stuff like that.
Okay. Okay. That's really interesting. All
Yeah.
right. So where does that take us next?
Yeah,
So now,
Okay. So let's talk about liquid democracy. So
yeah,
ooh,
I was at the point and thinking about how we could design institutions. And so this is where we might, start into talking about things that are not fully implementable. But I thought of the systems as expanding our imagination about how we can do democratic institutions and where we could actually just look if we had to come up with new types of institutions. And also something that is super important for me is I'm really not after the ultimate form of governments. It's something that is often actually discussed in the literature, and I don't think this exists
mm,
because I think that any institution, regardless of manipulation, just by the nature of these institutions and the fact that they're created for particular initial conditions, things get oxidated. And so I'm more thinking about institutions that we can, update over time and having systems which just, have a set of toolbox and being, pluralist with our methods in some sense.
so
So
I
that'll make
just
it.
want to react really quickly to. I definitely don't want to interrupt, but I keep interrupting. I'm sorry, but just I hate me. So your oxidation. This is like rust, right? This is like the idea that the system is doesn't really work as it's not lubricated. It's not working as smoothly as it was originally for various reasons. And I've been I watched a little bit of the Super Bowl this year, which I think a lot of people do, but I don't generally. And one of the things I thought was really interesting is that it was not to be a spoiler for anyone, but it was like a tie at the end, and there's a rule about what do you do when there's a tie at the end, and that rule has changed since the last time there was a tie at the end at a Super Bowl.
huh?
So they had a different mechanism in place that had never really been played out before for a Super Bowl that played out, and I just thought this sort of notion of we make these systems, we make these sets of rules, we make these, I don't know, whatever societies, and we're constantly rebooting them, or at least making modifications and maintaining and updating them. And like part of me has always felt like, well, that's just a temporary thing. Eventually, you get the sport right, you get football right, like it's football, right? So it's just going to be what it's going to be. But the fact of the matter is, it continues to be updated all the time. And I feel like maybe that's actually not the special case. Maybe that is the norm. Like all these systems, once they've been codified, then they start to get rusty. They start to get oxidized, as you say, because people start to play into the system as opposed to kind of being consistent with the original intent of the rules. And so that you just keep updating the rules, which is really interesting from the perspective of, well, if it's not in the rules, like where's that actual original intent even represented?
Right. Yeah,
So okay,
yeah.
so I could see this applying in a governance kind of setting as well. It
And
certainly
I
happens
think
in reinforcement learning.
Go, man. Mental.
Manon.
yeah,
Yeah.
sorry, it's annoying French. We take letters together and they create new sound. But no, it's so interesting. And in fact, one of the core interests I have in this subject right now is that we take democratic institutions for granted. And I definitely grew up at a time and in a place where democracy was really taken for granted. And I think we forgot how alive these institutions are. And so I kind of advocate for this field of democratic innovation. And I want to treat you with a quote I found fascinating in that regard. It's something that Jefferson said. It's written in the Jefferson Memorial in DC. He says, "I am not an advocate for frequent changes in laws and constitutions, but laws and institutions must go hand in hand with the progress of the human mind. As that becomes more developed, more enlightened, as new discoveries are made, new truths discovered, and matters and options change. With the change of circumstances, institution must advance also to keep pace with the times." And the thing I find really interesting in the quote is it's not just about human manipulating the systems. It's also about, conditions changing. In
Mm,
Federalist 10, I think it's Madison who wrote Federalist 10. He writes that, and it's how they explain why they came up with the Constitution. there is a line where he explains that the factious state leader could never have influence over other states, and that the idea of having, a very strong faction, the effect of the faction would be limited to a particular state. And that was true at a time where communication, information travel was limited
Slow.
geographically.
Yeah.
And this initial condition is not true anymore.
Right.
And so it's why I like to think about, I think this is the type of changes that Jefferson is referring to. Changes are very, we should have a ton of friction with changes, especially with the Constitution. It's obviously something that, holds us together. And we should always also appreciate that a perfectly efficient system will never exist. So there is a tension here. But I like to think that we went a little bit too far in thinking that these things are static.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think just what you're saying, and also what Michael was saying, I am constantly wondering, is there some way that we could better express the intent? So when mechanisms go wrong, because people figure out ways to game the system or to game the overtime in the Super Bowl or whatever the hell that was, then we would automatically know that that was not an outcome that we wanted because they just did timeouts forever or something and the game never ended. And I don't know if it's possible, but I feel like, number one, exactly as you say, recognizing that the democracy is not a given, the rules that we have are not a given. All of this stuff happens by the consent of the governed, not in a legal sense, but in a riot sense, in a breakdown of society sense. And so keeping everybody happy enough to not break down society is a sort of physical goal. It's a sort of given, independent of whatever the law says, that kind of thing. And to me, that says there might be hope for coming up with some kind of language that has to do with, at each spatial and temporal scale, there should be some inflows and outflows that should match, something like that, that would allow us to would allow us to distinguish between Jefferson's needed changes because initial conditions are changing versus the ever-present pressure to corruption.
I think it's super interesting, and it's where the two things that I always have in mind in terms of how we want to design the systems is the idea of checks and balances and accountability to me is crucial, and the idea of being pluralist in our methods and realizing that we will never have the perfect inflows and outflows, and seeing these organisms or these institutions as organisms, as things that are alive, I think is quite powerful. Now, understanding when the time comes and not waiting too much, so that when you wait too much, people just want to break the system down instead of trying to do the incremental, best thing to do.
Fix it or screw it. Yeah.
Yeah. And maybe it's why. Yeah, it's why we get at a point where we think so much about these things, because I think I like recently it came to my mind that I used to think it was impossible for democracies, and in the US or where I'm from in France to disappear. And I still think it's very unlikely, but just I realized that actually history taught us that a system never lasted forever, and that we just have to hold in our head that this is a possibility and maybe it's plausible. And then what do we do with this? If we are really committed to the axiom I told at the beginning about freedom and self-determination and equality, if we are committed to this as I am, then how do we think about designing systems? Which led me partially to liquid democracy, though, no panacea, so sorry, it won't be the silver bullet that's going to fix it all. But I'm very happy to share a bit about what it is and how we thought about it, and how so there is also a beautiful math story that is getting entangled with democracy, with liquid democracy. So liquid democracy is a very simple system. It's one where at the time of a you have to make a decision or choose a representative, and the idea is that you can choose different representatives for different issues. So let's say that I can have you have a vote for education representatives and economy representatives, and that's the first thing. And the second thing is that I can either choose to self-select and become a representative myself. So there is no selection filter as we have currently in electoral systems. When you pick between candidate A and B, you have so much work that happened to know who were candidate A and B. And maybe the election is very democratic at the time of choosing between A and B, but you just had so much things happening before that is oftentimes actually, very clearly not ideally democratic. And so with liquid democracy, either I self-select or I delegate my votes to others. And very simple. And so, if I delegate my vote to you, Dave, and you delegate it to Michael, then we have this transitive delegation pattern where basically Michael now becomes the representative for both of us. And there are kind of two core ideas with liquid democracy. The first one is that we'd want to have lower entrance barriers into becoming a representative, and also the capability of having more chances of participating by giving your votes to different people for different issues. This is the first idea. And the second idea is that there is this wealth of information in society that we never really use, which is what I call second order information. So first order information is how much I know about education policies. And second order information is how much I know about what you know about education policies. And when we think about it, when I have to make decisions sometimes in either referendums or even when I have to pick a politician in a particular context, it happens very often that I'm actually very uninformed. I care a lot, and I might care even about the issue, but I'm just not particularly informed. But I know so many people around me. I know so much about other people who could be better than myself to decide for us whether we choose this person or that person or what we should do even. And so the idea of liquid democracy is to have a better representation and better chances for representation by having this, I hate this term, but we call it liquidity, which is like you have this idea of like a liquid flow where you have more chances of participating, you use more of the information that are embedded in our social networks through what we know about one another. And we have the possibility of picking different representatives for different issues. Why does that inspire you?
So the liquidity is really about the flow of information. I think Bob's our guy when it comes to economic choices or whatever it is, and the goal is to be able to capture more of that information in a voting system so that we get better outcomes. Something like that.
Yeah, and it really reconciles this idea of also having maybe better outcome because you choose people who would know more about particular issues, but you also try to create a more fair procedure. It's both about the outcome, about the procedure, because you have more chances of becoming a representative yourself, and you have this idea of you always know who your representative is in the system. It cannot happen that you're in an election and you voted for candidate A, but the majority voted for B, so for 4 years you're not represented. Here, because it's also a multi-winner system, so you have multiple people that are representing everyone who was selected by others becomes a representative.
Oh, wait a minute. So it's not like if I delegate to Michael, it doesn't mean that his decision counts for 2 votes. It means I'm voting for Michael to be the winner.
Oh, so both. Michael votes now is weighted by the number of people that he represents.
Delegated. Uh-huh.
Yes.
And
he acts as a representative.
And you mean assuming nobody else got 3 votes, if Michael got 2 and so forth. I mean, I guess I missed that entire aspect of it. That it's not that there's a slate of candidates that we're choosing among. We're saying we need an economics guy or we need an electrician. So we vote for everybody. I either vote for myself or I delegate to somebody who I think is a better electrician, and then we sort all that out, and whoever's at the top is the electrician, and if there's ties, there's multiple electricians. How does it go?
No, so the idea would be more to use this to form a Congress type of institution. So then you could, ideally, if you don't have too many people, every person who was selected, and you can also have this thing that if you're selected, you don't really want to run, but you see that so many people trusted you, maybe the people that didn't want to do it will do it. But so these create a Congress in a way, and the weight of every Congress member is weighted by the number of people they represent.
So we're saying everybody is in the Congress, or everybody that has at least one delegate pointing at them is part of the Congress? Is that the idea?
Yeah, I would think of it as everybody's in the Congress, but you can leave the Congress and you can leave your vote with someone else as you back away. Right?
So which like proxy voting in stocks does this.
Exactly.
Like that. And so the idea is all citizens have a share in the company, in the country, and they can proxy their vote to somebody else. And so there is no picking of a slate. We don't even know how big the Congress is going to be because in principle it's everybody, even though many, many, many people may in fact have 0 votes because they delegated.
Exactly. And so you have and we can talk also more about all of these practical implications about having one person with a ton of votes that can effectively,
Right.
have a
Right.
dictatorial.
Right, be a dictator. Yeah, right.
Exactly. Or just the other end of the spectrum, having too many people, and then the Congress
Can't
is
make a
just
decision.
enormous.
Right. Just
Uh,
too granular. Because I have
well, I
two big
mean,
questions about this, right?
go ahead, Michael.
One is, I guess one is theoretical and one is practical. So the theoretical question is, are there interesting sort of mathematical properties of this? And the practical one is, have people tried this? Because like you could imagine running a department, like an academic department this way, or any group, like any club, like a community club or something like that. This could be experimented with to see what kind of things work well and what kind of things don't work well.
Yes, absolutely. So I'll start by the second question because it's much easier. But then the first one is beautiful. So I'm going to give you the answer for the first question just in a minute. So it's been tried around in a few places. Most prominently, it was the Pirate Party in Germany that tried it out and used it for some of its decisions. It also been tried at Google, I think in 2015. It was tried for 3 years, and I think they wrote a paper about it in 2015 about the so like internal decision making amongst employees. We actually did an experiment in my department at MIT to gather the community's inputs on 11 questions that the department was thinking about. You have a few other experiments here and there. And so we start having more and more empirical data. In my thesis, I also ran 12 experiments of liquid democracy, but it was, lab experiments. So we had super interesting results, and I think I'm going to get to them as I talk about the theory. But um, they were in a context that is less generalizable than something like the Pirate Party because we didn't have the kind of real world democratic impact. But so it's being tried. The system was first mentioned, as far as I know, by Lewis Carroll, who wrote Alice in the Wonderworld. So the idea has been around for a while. It was revived in 1969 by my professor Miller, who wrote about more in a version of proxy voting, and it kind of really started again in the early 2000s. And so yeah, in political context, it's been tried out a few times, not that often. It's also been tried in the decentralized autonomous organization. It also had the interest of communities such as DAOs and crypto-based organizations. So that's for the empirical side. So for the theory, which to explain the theory, you actually need to back up a tiny bit to start with. Kind of, it's almost the history of the field. So people have been thinking about how you put math on democracy for, I'm sure, much longer than you'd think. When do you think is like the first person who did this, if you had to guess?
If Aristotle.
I know, a bit later still.
All right, I tried.
Condorcet.
Yes,
Ooh, good one.
I mean, actually, and you had Plato has some like very numbered way of thinking about the ideal city. So maybe that's not so wrong. In fact, the very first person we trace back in the history of the field is someone called Ramon Llull. He was Ramon Llull. He was a Catalan.
Hammurabi. Is that who
That's
we're
what I'm
talking
hearing,
about?
but maybe
Okay.
not.
I've heard of him before.
Like Babylon?
Yeah.
A Catalan thinker, Ramonlull.
Oh, maybe
Is that who you're
not.
thinking about?
I don't know who we're talking about. Just tell us about the person.
Well, he was a thinker from Catalonia from the 13th century, and he was thinking about how you could elect religious leaders. And he realized that it's actually quite a mess because if you have M candidates, you might wonder whether everyone should choose one person or should just say who they approve and who they disapprove, or whether they should rank the M candidates. And if you look at the different ways of doing elections with the same people, you can actually get different outcomes. And this creates a pretty big problem for the legitimacy of the outcomes. And so he started looking at a few different methods. The one I prefer of his time was he had this idea of you would put the M candidates in a room and you would have them stand up 2 by 2, and you would have the rest of the crowd say, I prefer this one to that one. And you would do this with all of the pairs, and then you would say that the person who won most of the head-to-head comparison would exactly. But this is computationally pretty heavy because you have to do the all of the pairs within the M candidates. Anyway, and so he's been thinking about this and has some very interesting work. But the first person who actually put, formalism, actual mathematical formalism around this is as you were saying, Dave, the Nicolas de Condorcet, who's a French philosopher and mathematician. And he started looking at what happens when you rank people in particular. And this is a very pessimistic side of social choice, and I won't talk too much about it. I'll only talk about the optimistic side.
Mhm.
But maybe you've heard of this ideas of Condorcet cycle,
Mhm.
which is, let's say that we are the three candidates, and a majority of the people prefer Michael to Dave, a majority prefer Dave to me, and a majority prefer me to Michael. Then none of us can actually claim to have won the election because everyone has a chance of saying, no, actually, I beat you, so I should be the elected person. And he has really fascinating results about all of this, and then he started this like very long line of work with a ton of impossibility theorems that tell us that we basically don't have an ideal voting system. We can talk a bit more about this after, but to actually tie it back to liquid democracy, he founded this kind of this idea of or I don't know if discovered or founded, but of collective intelligence. And the
Mm.
way he did this was with one of his positive results. And if I say the positive result very simply, he says basically that if you have a very large population, a probability, and you have a binary decision, and one of the outcome is better than the other. Of course, you don't know it a priori, but the point of choosing and of voting is to actually try to set your society on the best track. And he says that if the votes are independent and under other mild condition, if your population is really large, the probability that a majority of your society is correct goes to one as the size of the population increases. So he's basically saying majority will be always correct asymptotically.
If the population is big enough,
Yes.
even if
If the,
they're all really stupid.
so that's the crux. So and I can explicit. Yes, go ahead.
No. I'm stupid's probably not the right word, but there's probably something about being informed or being aligned with the right answer or something like that. Like that, it only has to be marginally true that they're more aligned with the right answer, but it does have to be marginally true, right?
Exactly. So the way you can think of it is really he modeled humans as coins. And everyone was correct with the probability p and was incorrect with probability 1 minus p. And as long as the average p of your population is above a half,
There we go.
then his result holds. But now it is also true that if the average p is below a half, then with high probability, the society is always wrong. So you have this like very kind of, binary results where you either have the confusion of the multitude or you have the wisdom of crowds or collective intelligence.
Right.
And there was
And
something,
go
and
ahead.
that's
Go
something
ahead.
from 1785, which is
Nice.
it's hard to actually know what causal impact it had on how we design, democracies, but there is something just beautiful in thinking that he proved this at a time where countries were starting to experiment with new systems.
It's a funny kind of thing, though, because given where I come from with this structure at all scales idea, there's an implicit assumption there that bigger is better. That, and I think that's wrong. I think, we would rather have a smaller group that tries to come together and then makes a vote, and then there's a separate level of process for the next layer up. However it is that we try to make those groups and however it is that we try to merge them together. But again, I worry in the theoretical side of things how easy it is to slide into sort of like thermodynamic limits and stuff like that of infinite numbers of voters without thinking that maybe we shouldn't be heading down that road hardly at all.
And I think this is completely right. And also goes to this, we are getting closer and closer to the fact that these models are maybe merely metaphors for how humans actually make decisions and that we should really take them with a grain of salt. And there is also in the theory things that would accommodate what you were saying, in that one of the core assumptions is that votes are independent. If now you start
Right. Yes.
imposing more and more dependence between the votes, then you will prove that based on some particular assumptions on basically the distribution of expertise and the pairwise correlation, then you might end up with systems where it's actually much better to have a small committee
Mm.
over an infinite number of people.
Well, and that was exactly what appealed to me when I was glancing at liquid democracy, that, at least the idea of delegating your vote is explicitly modeling non-independence among the voters. Because I'm saying I'm going to vote however Manon does, like that. And the thing that bugs me about lots and lots of theoretical approaches is, as you say, they do assume independence at the base. And that is so easily corrupted that it almost makes me despair of coming up with theory that will help more than it hurts. Am I too pessimistic there?
No, I think you're completely right. I
Mhm.
think it really to me goes back to this idea of kind of oxidated systems. Maybe when Condorcet thought about this, the society was distributed enough that you could make a reasonable assumption that you had some level of independence.
Right.
And it is true that you have some level of independence, and you can also adapt the Condorcet theorem by adding correlation, and it is still valid up to some point.
Sure.
But it also true to think that we are at a time where it is so easy and not that expensive to just create this massive information campaign that just correlates everyone votes in some
Right.
way. But this assumption doesn't seem as valid as it may have been before. Also, for a really long time, people thought that it was silly to think that people could have a p that was below a half. Why would people vote in a way that would be worse than a random coin? It didn't make any sense. At least you're random. You're not worse than random.
I think these days we think it's very easy to imagine how people could vote worse than a random coin.
I mean, and
But
we even have, a bunch of polls about a bunch of questions where you actually have more than half of the people that get the wrong answer. And so
right.
both the
Yeah, yeah.
assumptions and what we know about humans and
Mhm.
society and how society changed question these types of theory. And in fact, the theory of liquid democracy should also be subjected to the same level of scrutiny. So the result I'm going to tell you now doesn't really escape all of the criticism that you're already advancing. But the so one thing that you see with the corner surgery theorem, it's the name that was given to the corner surgery result I was mentioning afterwards, is that you have this like binary result. So if the average expertise is below a half, then you have this catastrophic situation, and if it's a
Right.
bit above a half, then you have this amazing situation. And one thing so thinking about liquid democracy, the idea is that you could keep having really good results, but maybe when you're in a situation where the average p is below a half, then you could maybe be able to delegate to people that on average are, better than random. Um, but the cost that you might be paying for this is that you might end up concentrating power.
Right.
And so when you think about liquid democracy, the way you would think about it mathematically is that instead of looking at the sum of the votes, you look at the sum of the weighted votes. And in the extreme case where one weight is n and everyone else's weight is 0, then you just end up with one person voting, and the probability for one person to be true is just their p, and it is just strictly
A-
be to 1, and yeah,
And the variance is maximized,
yeah.
or depending on their p. Okay.
So,
Uh,
and so you have this. Go ahead. Sorry.
no, that's it.
Well, I feel like you're gonna sneak back in second order knowledge, aren't you? You're gonna have another P, which is how good are you at identifying somebody else's P?
So it's exactly what you get when you do the modeling for liquid democracy. And so again, high level, you have this idea that maybe you're going to improve the average voting competence by using the second order knowledge, but you're risking to concentrate power too much. So you have some tension here. And what I spent some time doing during my PhD was finding the regimes. So it's like kind of the equivalent of what Condorcet did for direct democracy, but now for liquid democracy, where we identify the regime in which liquid democracy works, which is the equivalent of p is above a half, and you identify the regimes where liquid democracy doesn't work, which is when p is below a half. And to do this, exactly, you need to be able to model how people make these delegation choices. And so we define these ideas of potential functions that are telling us with which probability every agent in your graph will delegate to some of their neighbors. And basically what we do is we identify classes of these delegation functions, of these potential functions, such that liquid democracy is guaranteed to work well. And so, at the high level, really what we're doing is we're saying in these scenarios, things will be fine. And in these scenarios, things won't be fine. The thing that was pretty beautiful for me is that we then ran a bunch of experiments. As I said, I ran 12 experiments during my PhD. And I actually approached the question with the skepticism that you were having. I was thinking, this is a mathematical theory. I'm sure there are so many of the assumptions that we have that, won't carry over experimentations. And so I was really expecting not to see alignment between the experiment and the theory, and with limitations that come with having just 12 experiments, of course. But we developed a method to statistically estimate these potential functions within our delegation graphs. And what we found is that the way in which people ended up delegating, so how they leveraged this second order knowledge, was exactly as in one of the classes that we had identified theoretically, which
cool.
was quite interesting and made me think that maybe I should think more about liquid democracy as one of many tools, and not just the panacea. This has never been my approach to these problems.
So in your studies, you were taking existing communities of various
Yes,
sorts so that they could have second order knowledge and so forth, and then asking them to pick experts or something like that. Uh, um,
exactly.
and did you also have a case of a random control group that had no second order knowledge because they didn't know who else was in the group to compare to, or just went with existing communities?
No, we just went with existing communities, and the point of the experiment was to reconstruct statistically this delegation decision that we modeled through a literally a function. So for us, it was really trying to do a statistical estimation of the theoretical objects that we had
Uh-huh.
studied before.
Oh, that's really fascinating. Man, we're starting to run out of time here, and I hate it because I always love these conversations, man. But uh, um, is there a final thought on liquid democracy, or should we switch gears for the last couple minutes?
Let's switch gears.
So you also had a paper that caught my eye that talked about resonance in political systems in France or something like that. Could you give me I mean, I'm a big resonance fan in the sense of like engineered systems, like phase locked loops and all that kind of stuff. What does resonance even mean in the case of people and political systems?
Yeah, well, that is indeed changing gears quite a bit. And I had a core interest that I had also in my research is better understanding information disorders. When we think about democracy, this seems to be quite a central piece to our current problems. And so yeah, the resonance work is a work I did with a sociologist, Boyan Park at Harvard. And we've been trying to understand how the political messages or the messages that you can find in the press in general. So what is coming from the politicians or the journalists is resonating with some prior frame that citizens have about particular issues. And so this is purely empirical. We've been working with a very large corpus, with a very large corpus of texts that had been collected by the French, the Élysée, which is the presidential office, where they had surveyed people for 5 years, asking them what they had heard and what they had, in a sense, they didn't say resonated with, but it was what caught your eye in the news in the
I
past
see.
week.
What's stuck in people's minds?
Yes.
Something like that.
And we're trying to understand how much your prior information or knowledge about something is influenced or influences what you hear. And
And we would expect it's a lot.
yeah,
The-
it's and you have these ideas of how you have, and so we were basing this on a sociological theory of resonance, which was the field that Boyun was coming from. And you have this idea that you can resonate with a concept for different reasons because you have some internal alignment with what you're hearing, or you have a prior that is very contrary to what you're hearing.
oh,
Mm.
so you
And
could resonate like out of phase or something.
Mm.
yeah,
I hate that. I really hate that. And I
Or
can't
it's just
stop.
like, wait, if that's true, that really is going to overturn a lot of my understanding. I better look into this.
So it
yes.
could be important. Oh, I see it. And wow, oh, that's wild.
And there was one thing that we actually we had traces of it, and it's something that we say at the end of the paper that is not the main point of the paper, but that I found really fascinating, which was that the data that we analyzed were pre-Yellow Jackets, which is this big protest that happened in France at
Oh,
the
uh-huh. Yeah,
at
yeah.
the beginning of President Macron's terms, and it's fascinating that some of the central themes of the Yellow Jackets crisis, you could hear them from the People's Report and not in the news. So I think I always had this idea that there was this like top to bottom influence
Mm.
in how, you know, the discourse in democracies was happening. And I had this traces of, intuition in the data that actually you had this bottom up emulation of people starting showing up signs of these frustrations. And we start seeing it years before the Yellow Jacket crisis actually started,
Cool.
which is one of the things I remembered from the paper I
Wow.
found
That's
really
great.
interesting.
So Arab Spring and all that kind of stuff can be real, and in principle, one could see the early signs of it in a system that looks stable, something like that.
Right. If you talk to people.
Well, so Manon, this is really great. Thanks so much for talking to us. So my last question for you is: is democracy screwed? Is there a path here? What should we be doing to help out democracy?
Democracy is not screwed, and we all have
Okay.
agency in this process. And it's so hard when we've taken something for granted. It's hard to think that we can influence its future. But I think that we all have, potential influence on its future, and we're going to do this better if we actually work together. So I'm very optimistic. I think there is this idea of being l'optimiste désespéré. This is French. It means like you're desperately optimist, which is kind of a contradiction. Um, and now what do we do? That's you know that's a hard question. I don't think that studying this math models is gonna be what helps us the most. So I'm trying to be thinking much more proactively how to get closer and closer to reality. I told you I started with math and then philosophy, and now I'm trying to talk much more with people on the grounds that are living democracy and doing democracy, just thinking democracy. And I think to me, maybe the last thought I want to uh, close our conversation with is maybe that we should start by rebuilding the trust that we have between one another. There is this line in one of Frederick Douglass' speech on the composite nation when he talks about Reconstruction, where he says something along the lines of what really matters here is not the institutional design. We could have different form of governments. It's not what's going to set this country up for success. It's really the how the humans interact and relate to one another. And I think this might be one of the most crucial issue of our decades is to try to understand how we can reconnect and regain trust in one another and realizing that some of these core principles on which we've been resting these institutions like freedom and self-determination are values that most of us actually passionately care about and that there are so many areas in which we can reconnect and bridge our divides. And that might be what matters the most is repairing our social fabrics might be much more important than the great institution.
Oh man, and that's great. That seems like a great place to leave it. Thank you so much for talking to us.
It was a pleasure. Thanks.
Thanks.
This was Computing Up. Thanks for listening.